In this video, we're going to look at consumers and producers surplus. So over here on the right, right over here, there's a demand curve and a supply curve. So the demand curve is this one here that decreases, okay, and the supply curve increases. Now, notice both say P equals and then a function in terms of X. So the demand curve is a price in terms of X, where X represents quantity or a number of units of an item that is being produced. And supply is also, the supply curve is also gives you price in terms of the quantity or number of units supplied. Okay, so the consumer's demand curve, P equals D of X, is the price per unit, P, that a consumer is willing to pay for X units of a product. So if there are X units of an item out there on the market, consumers will pay this price for it. The fewer that there are, the more that people will pay for it. So, for example, right here, when 5 of whatever item this is modeling, 5 items are being sold, consumers will pay willingly a price of $4 per item. But the more of them that there are, the more flooded the market becomes, consumers are willing to pay less and less for that item. If there's, say, 15 of an item out there, there's more of them, consumers are only willing to pay, in this example, $1 per unit, okay? The point is that it decreases. As the market becomes flooded with more and more and more of an item, people are willing to pay less and less for it. The supply curve is the opposite. It goes up. Okay, it's the price per unit P that a producer is willing to accept for selling X units. So here's P equals S of X. So this is from the producer's side. So if you are producing and selling an item, if you're only selling 1 or 2, maybe you're willing to sell those at a cheaper price. But the more of something that you're going to sell, the more items you're going to put out on the market, the more money you want to make for them. So if you put in the time and effort to make 20 units, you're going to want to make, say, $4 per unit, whereas if you are only selling 1, yeah, you know, it's only 1, so it's not a money maker item, so you're okay with selling it for less money. Okay, so it tends to increase as the number of items increases. Somewhere along the way, a supply curve and a demand curve will cross. And at this point, we call it an equilibrium point, where the market is in equilibrium, where the number of items being sold is denoted by X sub E, and the price that they're being sold at is called P sub E. So it represents the price that consumers are willing to pay when X sub E units of the item are produced, and it's where the suppliers and the consumers agree that you have a certain number being sold and we agree on a price, okay? Everybody's happy, right? Well, at that point, we can talk about, or really at any point, we can talk about what's called consumer surplus and producer surplus, which is best represented graphically. There's a really great tutorial. It's a bit long, but it's a great tutorial, an explanation of all this on the Khan Academy. So if you go to khanacademy.org and you search consumer and producer surplus, there's a 4-video series that I highly recommend for explaining this in far more detail with numbers and examples. Okay, but consumer surplus, often represented CS, is defined, no, I'm sorry, that's not CS right there, that's not consumer surplus. That was a typo there. The total utility received, okay, by consumers is the total area under this curve from 0 out to, say, Q is for quantity, to Q units of the item being sold. So in other words, maybe the first person, let's say that was like the first item being sold, that person would have paid this much for it if that was the only item on the market. Maybe the next person would have paid this much money for it. But that's not what happened. Instead, Q items were put on the market and sold at a price of P. All of them were sold at a price of P. So that first guy who would have paid this much for it only had to pay this much for it. So he got this much in excess. That's his consumer surplus, right? And then maybe the next item sold, maybe that guy would have paid this much for it, but he only had to pay a price P. So he got this excess amount. So the consumer surplus is like the extra, or the total amount that consumers are willing to spend on up to Q units. But they get a little bit of extra kind of for free because they only had to pay P dollars for those Q units, okay? So right here, the consumer surplus is defined. This is where CS goes. Consumer surplus is defined as the integral out to some quantity Q, or maybe the equilibrium quantity, X sub B, and it is the demand function minus the P sub B, okay, minus the demand price. What happens when you integrate is you get P sub B times X, and then you plug in your limits of integration, and essentially what happens is you subtract off the area of this rectangle. So the consumer surplus is the area of the red region, okay, it's the demand, it's the integral of the demand function from 0 to Q minus this stuff that minus this area of this rectangle, okay, because only the area up above the rectangle is actually consumer surplus. So what it measures is the amount of surplus money that results when a purchase is made at a price that is lower than the maximum the consumer was willing to pay. So maybe at the equilibrium point, consumers got a little bit extra, okay, for what they paid. They would have they would have paid more, or some of them would have paid more for those items being sold. Producer surplus depends on the supply function. So if you are producing X items, you're willing to sell maybe just one item at a lower price, but the more items you sell, the higher the price you want to sell them at. So if you sell Q units and you sell them all at a price of P, this green area in here is like excess money that you made, okay? It measures the additional money contributed by consumers on the sale of X sub B units of a product. So the producer surplus, often denoted PS, is equal to the integral from 0 to X of the equilibrium price minus the supply function. What that does is it takes the area of this whole rectangle and subtracts off the area under the supply function there. Okay, now you can technically talk about consumer surplus and producer surplus at any quantity and price, but if you're at the equilibrium quantity and the equilibrium price, it's represented by this graph here. The consumer surplus is the area of that region, and the producer surplus is the area of this region.